welcome back to the tutorial on capturing mental representations through drawing and crowdsourced scoring. I strongly encourage you to take a look at our corresponding paper and our OSF repository. And so in this second lesson, I'm going to tell you about how to code an actual drawing experiment. First, before we can go into that, I want to tell you a little bit about basic web architecture. Specifically in this lesson, I'm going to tell you about client-side scripting, which are the programming languages we interact with when we want to make what appears in your web browser, your browser client. When we make a web page, we mainly deal with three main languages: HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. I'm just going to give you a little glimpse into what these languages look like and what they generally do. And I'm going to show you some very brief example code snippets, but don't worry, at the very end of this lesson, I'm going to point you to some web resources that can give you really in-depth tutorials about these three different programming languages. So the first language, and maybe the most important one that we interact with when making a web page, is HTML. This stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and this defines the structure of your web page. It's also pretty much the minimum you need for a web page. You do not need JavaScript and CSS to make a functioning web page. In terms of how you can identify HTML code, its code is generally defined in tags that are surrounded by what we can call carets or these greater and less than signs. And tags start with open and close caret like this, and then they end with a slash. So here's just an example code snippet written in HTML. This is taken from my personal web page. And what this is here is that it's showing us a list of potential links. And so the UL here starts an unordered list. We then have two list items, and so those are distinguished with this LI tag here. So this will end up looking like a bullet point. Then after we start the list item, we then have this A tag here. What that is that gives us a link that when you click on this text here, it will send us to this publications.html, to this address defined by this href. And so after the tag, we put the text of the link. So when you click publications, you will go to this link. And then after that, we close our tag. So we close the link tag, and then we also close the list item tag. So another common programming language you will use when developing a web page is JavaScript. So JavaScript is code that dynamically influences your web page. And it looks like other more traditional programming languages you might have dealt with in the past. And so JavaScript can include things like functions, variables, loops, and if statements. You cannot do this for HTML alone. Visually, you can characterize JavaScript with the usage of parentheses, curly braces, and most of the lines tend to end with semicolons. And you can embed JavaScript in HTML with this specific tag here. This script type is JavaScript. And so here's an example of a snippet of JavaScript code. First, we're embedding it into an HTML document. So we have this script tag here. And then what this JavaScript code does is that it defines this function that I've called change button here. And what it's doing is it's getting this element that's in the web page. This element is called test, and it's changing the inner HTML of this element. And what it's changing it to is to this new HTML. You can see that it's HTML because it has this a tag here. This U tag actually makes the text underlined. So essentially this JavaScript is saying, okay, for this web document, get the element that's called test. Let's change its HTML so that it now says this. And this is what happens when we click a button that calls this change button function. And then finally, we close the JavaScript with this close script tag. Finally, the third language that we will deal with is CSS. This stands for Cascading Style Sheet. And what this does is it defines the style of your web page, things like colors, sizes, and fonts. This is often used for making sure that many web pages have a unified style by having them all refer to the same style sheet. And we can embed CSS in HTML using the style tag like this. So we have our style tag, and then in this example here, we're defining the style for a paragraph, which is signified by the P here. And we're specifically saying, make the text in the paragraph this specific color and make it this specific font size of 24 pixels. Okay, so now that I've gone into some basic web architecture, now I can tell you about the architecture of a drawing experiment. So what we generally tend to do is use HTML to make the basic look of the web page, and you can use it to insert instructions and also to have questionnaire survey items. We then use JavaScript on top of that to insert the drawing interface and also handle buttons that dynamically interact with the web page. So to insert buttons that proceed on to the next trial or buttons that save the drawing. We also use JavaScript to deal with any sort of trial timing. And for the drawing interface, what I specifically use is the WPaint JavaScript plugin. This is an open source JavaScript plugin, but there are many other potential JavaScript plugins you can use for drawing. And please refer to our OSF wiki for a list of some of these other options, because it is possible that WPaint may not fully suit your needs. I use relatively minimal CSS in these experiments. I only use it sometimes to change styling. And so now for the rest of this lesson, I'm going to go through the 3 of the 4 examples code bases that we make available on the OSF wiki. So in the first example, I'm going to show you an experiment that's just the drawing interface. Then in the second example, I'm going to show you code that is built upon this drawing interface that also includes mouse movement tracking. Then in the third example, I'm going to show you one that builds upon example 2 that now also includes timed trials. And then we're not going to go into example 4 in this lesson, but we're going to go into it in the next lesson, because example 4 deals with interacting with a server, saving your own data on your own database. And so I'm going to tell you how to do that in lesson 3. Okay, so now I'm going to show you what it's like to actually code a web page, code all these different programming languages, and also how to debug your code. Okay, so here is the folder for example 1. This is what's available on our online code base. And so you can see here we have example1.html. That is a web page for that experiment. And so if you just open it in your browser, you can see exactly what that experiment looks like. So you see we have the drawing interface here, and then you have the button to save the drawing. But one great thing about web programming is that you don't need any specific program to write the code, to edit the code, or do any debugging. Actually, I do all of my web programming just in a simple text editor. So instead of just double clicking on this HTML file or opening it in your browser, you can instead open it in your text editor. I like to use Notepad++. Many people also use a program called BBEdit. And these are great. They're text editors that also color your code smartly based on what programming language you're writing in. So here's the code for that example 1. And so I'm just going to walk you through what the code looks like for example 1, but this is also heavily commented, so please refer back to the code if you have more specific questions. So off the bat, you can see that this is a lot of HTML because you see all of these greater than and less than signs and these tags, right? And so pretty much in the body of the experiment, this is where we define the different structural pieces of the experiment. So here, this is inserting the drawing interface. Then here we have a hidden tag. So one thing that's important for any online experiment is that you will deal a lot with input tags. Input tags are essentially questionnaire form items. So you can have radio buttons, text inputs, check boxes. Those all end up being input tags, just the type differs. It might be the type is radio, the type is text, etc. And I also heavily use hidden input types. These are ones in which the user, the participant doesn't actually see what's being saved in that tag, but it does get saved for the experimenter. So here is where we're going to hide all the data that represents the drawing and then send it to our database. And the reason we hide it is because the data for drawing actually looks fairly complex. It's not just the image file. We'll go into this in the next few lessons, what a drawing is represented as. But we hide this from the participant because they don't need to see the big text representation of the image. And then finally here we have the save button. And so those are all the structural pieces of our web page. After this, we then have JavaScript. So here you can see there's all this script type is JavaScript. We're basically loading in all these plugins that allow us to use a drawing interface. And I actually host WPaint, the drawing interface, on my page, my website for now. Then finally, we have some JavaScript that we've written inline into the script here. What this is doing is that this is initializing our drawing interface. So I'm setting things like I want the background color to be white, or I want you to start off with a pencil that has a line width of 3. And then finally, I've also added a function that adds functionality to that save button that saves what's in the image to that hidden input that I showed you earlier. Yeah, and so as you can see, you just write HTML and JavaScript all into the same text file. You save it as a .html file, and then you can open it up with your browser. So let me show you what the other experiments look like. So we have example 2 here. It looks very similar, but it's also tracking your mouse movements. So one great way that you can debug your web pages is you can use the inspect or inspect elements options that exist on your web browser. So if I right click here, I can go down to inspect element. If you're on Chrome, it will just say inspect. I think these may not be features in Safari or Internet Explorer, so you may have to use Firefox or Chrome. And if you do that, you can actually do this on any website, then you get all this rich information about what's happening under the hood for that web page. So here I can actually see all of the code for the web page, and you can actually expand and look at different portions of the page. See, you can see all these comments that I wrote. But what I often use is also the console. That lets you interact with the page, see what's stored in different variables, and you can also see anything that's outputted by the programmer. And so for this example 2, it's tracking your mouse movements, and I've also put it so that it saves out the mouse movements to the console so we can make sure that it's working. So as I start drawing, you see the mouse coordinates are being outputted here to the console. So we can see that it's working and we can see where the coordinates are being captured. Yep. And so if I click Save Drawing, I can also do things, as I mentioned, like interact with variables. So one thing you may often use is document.getElementById. This basically gets an element that is named a certain way. So let's see. Mouse move 1, let's see, I think it's mouse move 1 ID. Is that it? No, it's mouse move ID. Yep. And so I'm saving the mouse movements in something called mouse move ID. And so this is basically saying, tell me what is stored in that element called mouse move ID. And here are all the coordinates that are being saved. And so we can now look back to the code for example 2 and see if this maps onto what we just experienced as someone interacting with the experiment on the browser. So here's example 2. Much of the code is the same as the code in example 1. So I'm going to scroll down to the specific parts that differed here in yellow. So here's a new code that I've put in, and this handles all the mouse movement tracking. So what this is essentially doing is that when the mouse is clicked down, when it's mouse down, it knows that we're clicking the mouse. Now when the mouse is moving, if the mouse is clicked down and if the mouse is falling into these specific coordinates that are the drawing interface, then print out where the mouse is and save it in this variable called mouse movements. Again, you can look into the code, look at the code and look through the comments if you want to look through it more carefully. And then finally, when someone releases their mouse click, when the mouse goes up, we say we're no longer clicking. And I also include this 9999 to show that that's the end of a mouse click movement. And so this console.log here is actually making it output the mouse movements like we were seeing it happen here. And if you might remember, I interacted with this mouse move ID element. Well, that's actually saved. We're actually saving the mouse movements into mouse move ID in this piece of code here. And that's actually a hidden input that we have here at the top of the HTML. Finally, let me show you what example 3 looks like. So this one now includes trial timing. So first, you're going to see an image. Then we're going to be asked to draw the image. Then we will see image 2, be asked to draw image 2, and then we will answer some questionnaire questions. So there are 5 components to this example. So I hit the start button. We see the first stimulus for 1 second. Then we draw it. It's not exactly what it looked like. Something like that. There's a chef drinking the wine bottle, right? There's the second stimulus. It's a vase that has flowers, right? And now we're at the 5th phase of the experiment where you enter in your demographic information. Yep. And so now the code for this example 3 is a little more complex because it has these time trials in these different phases. First, this is an example of CSS code that we've written inline into the script. And this is because the default appearance of buttons is, they tend to look like this. They're very small and hard to see. So here we've included CSS to make the button larger and easier to see. And so that's essentially what this CSS code is doing right here. And it's also setting the color of various elements of the page. Now, in that last phase of the experiment, we had some questionnaire questions. And you might remember I mentioned at the beginning that HTML can be used for inserting questionnaire items. And so here are just some examples of how you can use the input tag to ask different types of questions. We have radio buttons for asking what your device is, but we also have a text input for asking your age. And then finally, at the bottom of the script, we have new JavaScript that handles the different trials of the experiment. You can see I have this function here called animate experiment. And what it does is it goes through each trial. So we have 5 different sort of phases or trials. And essentially it's saying, oh, when it's the first phase, then you will do these different things. You will display the image. When it's the second trial, you do these things, third, etc. One function that might be useful for you if you want to use JavaScript to code a timed experiment is the set timeout function. What this does is that it calls this method after this amount of time. So this is saying, call this animate experiment function after 1,000 milliseconds have elapsed. And so if I wanted to present the image for a longer period of time, I would set stim time to something like 5,000, for example. And then I also have a helper function here that displays an image. This code is not written in a very efficient way. As you can see, I'm actually putting in new commands for every single phase. But if you end up having many different trials of the same type, you can probably code it in a more efficient way. But this is coded in this way just to make it very clear. Yep. And so that's just pretty much in a nutshell how you can write code in a standard text editor. You can then try out the code in your web browser. You can debug it by using the inspect element function. And I've gone through a little bit and how these specific examples use HTML, JavaScript, and CSS to make a drawing experiment. To learn more about these different languages, I highly encourage you to take a look at some of these useful resources. I learned everything I know about web programming from W3 Schools and HTML Goodies. They're wonderful free resources. And so the main takeaway I want you to get from this lesson is that in making an experiment, you're basically learning to be a web designer. You're making a dynamic web page. So there are these different programming languages that you might need to gain familiarity with, but I think these are all very powerful tools that are going to become increasingly more important as we take a lot of research online. And so in the next lesson, I'm going to tell you, now that you have your experiment coded, how do you host it online? How do you send it out to participants? And how do you save and collect data? All right, see you then.